The December sun was beating down on the dusty roads of Lagos when Ngozi packed her designer suitcase for what she called a quick ancestral obligation trip. She was 26 years old, a rising social media influencer with over 200,000 followers who watched her every move on Instagram and TikTok. Her feed was filled with luxury restaurants, expensive wigs, beach parties in Lekki, and collaborations with big brands that paid her very well for a single post. She lived in a small but stylish apartment in Ikeja, and her whole life revolved around content creation, brand deals, and chasing the next viral moments that would boost her numbers. The only reason she was going back to her father's village in Osun State was because her grandmother had passed away 3 months ago, and the family was insisting that she must come home for the final burial ceremony. Ngozi had been making excuses for weeks, saying she was too busy with work and important meetings. But her mother's angry voice on the phone had finally broken her resistance. As she sat in the back of the air-conditioned bus heading towards the village, she scrolled through her phone with perfectly manicured nails, posting stories about her roots journey with aesthetic filters that made the dusty roads look artistic and mysterious. She had no real connection to the village because she had only visited twice in her entire adult life, and both times she had complained loudly about the lack of Wi-Fi, the outdoor toilets, and the slow pace of life. To her, the village represented everything she had worked hard to escape: poverty, backwardness, and old people who could not understand the modern world. She was going there to fulfill a duty, take some beautiful photos in traditional attire for content, and return to Lagos as quickly as possible before her followers forgot about her. The thought of spending more than 3 days in that place made her skin crawl with frustration and impatience. When the bus finally pulled into the small motor park near her father's village, the afternoon heat hit her like a heavy blanket soaked in hot water. The harmattan dust was everywhere, covering the leaves of the trees and making the air taste dry and metallic. She stepped out of the bus in her expensive sneakers and tight jeans, pulling her designer sunglasses down over her eyes as she looked around at the handful of old buildings and the group of local children who were staring at her like she had just landed from another planet. Her uncle, Babatunde, was waiting for her with a tired smile and a very old motorcycle that looked like it had survived 3 different wars. He greeted her warmly in Yoruba, but she responded in English with a flat voice that showed she was not interested in long conversations. As they rode through the narrow village paths toward her family compound, she held her nose because of the smell of burning firewood and the sight of free-range chickens running across the road. Everything about this place felt ancient, slow, and completely disconnected from the fast and shiny life she had built for herself in the city. The family compound was a collection of old houses with rusted zinc roofs, surrounded by tall mango trees and a few goats that were tied to wooden posts. Her relatives welcomed her with loud shouts of joy, hugging her tightly and speaking in rapid Yoruba that she could barely understand anymore. She forced a smile and took photos with the older women in their colorful wrappers, already planning which ones would look good on her Instagram grid with a caption about "connecting with my roots." That evening, after a meal of pounded yam and egusi soup that she barely touched because she was worried about her flat stomach, the elders of the family called for a meeting under the big Iroko tree in the center of the compound. The atmosphere became very serious as the oldest members sat on low wooden stools, their faces lined with deep wrinkles that told stories of decades lived in this place. Ngozi sat on a plastic chair at the edge of the gathering, trying to look respectful while secretly checking her phone for network signal. The head of the family, Papa Adeleke, who was her late grandmother's younger brother, cleared his throat and began to speak in a voice that was slow and heavy like the movement of ancient rivers. He welcomed Ngozi back home and thanked her for honoring her grandmother's memory by attending the final burial rites. Then his face became very stern and his eyes, which were clouded with age, seemed to look directly into her soul as he began to talk about the sacred forests that bordered the eastern edge of the village. He explained that this forest, known as Igbo Oro, the forest of spirits, had been standing there long before any living person was born, and it was the resting place of all their ancestors who had walked the earth before them. The forest was not just a collection of trees and animals, it was a voice that carried the weight of centuries. It was a spiritual gateway, a place where the living world touched the world of those who had passed on, and it was protected by very strict rules that no one in the family was allowed to break. Papa Adeleke leaned forward, his bony finger pointing toward the dark line of trees visible in the distance beyond the cassava farms. He told Ngozi that she must never, under any circumstances, enter that forest alone or without the guidance of the family priest. The ancestors were not always kind to those who disrespected their dwelling place, especially young people who had forgotten the old ways and the sacred traditions. He said that many years ago, when he was still a young man, a girl from a neighboring village had wandered into Igbo Oro to collect firewood, and she had come back speaking in tongues, her eyes completely white, unable to recognize her own mother. It took 7 days of prayers and sacrifices before her spirit was fully returned to her body. The other elders nodded their heads in solemn agreement, adding their own stories of strange disappearances, mysterious illnesses, and people who had lost their minds after breaking the rules of the forest. They all warned Ngozi to respect the boundary and to remember that not everything in life could be explained by science or modern thinking. Ngozi sat there listening with a small, polite smile on her face, but inside her mind, she was rolling her eyes so hard they almost disappeared into the back of her head. She thought the entire speech was nothing but superstitious nonsense from old people who had never left the village or seen the real world. She had traveled to Ghana, Dubai, and South Africa for brand events, and she had never encountered any spirits or ancestors chasing people in forests. To her, the forest was just a collection of trees, probably filled with monkeys, snakes, and maybe some rare plants that she could use for content. She nodded her head respectfully and said, "Yeah," in a soft voice. But she had already made up her mind that these warnings were outdated beliefs that had no place in her modern and educated life. As soon as the meeting ended, she went back to her room, turned on her phone's flashlight because there was no electricity, and began scrolling through her Instagram feed, comparing her life to lives of other influencers who were posting from luxury hotels and exclusive parties. The next morning, Ngozi woke up early because the loud crowing of roosters and the sound of women pounding yam outside her window made it impossible to sleep past 6 a.m. She was already bored and frustrated, counting down the hours until she could leave this place and return to civilization. As she sat on the veranda sipping a cup of very sweet tea that her aunt had made for her, she overheard two younger cousins talking excitedly about a rare herb that grew deep inside Igbo Oro. They said that the herb, known as Yu-Ato, was used by traditional healers to cure all kinds of sicknesses, and that it was so valuable that herbalists from far away would pay huge amounts of money for just a small bottle. One of the cousins mentioned that a man from Ibadan had recently offered 50,000 naira for a fresh batch of the leaves, but no one in the village was brave enough to go into the forest to collect it. Ngozi's ears perked up immediately like a cat hearing the sound of a mouse in the darkness. Her mind, which was always calculating new ways to make money and grow her brand, began to spin with exciting possibilities. She thought about how she could create an entire content series around natural herbs and traditional medicine, which was currently trending on social media. She imagined herself as the bold influencer who went into the forbidden forests to bring back ancient healing plants, positioning herself as a bridge between tradition and modernity. She could film the whole journey, post it as a documentary-style series, and probably get sponsorship deals from organic skincare brands and wellness companies. The financial opportunity was too good to ignore, and the fact that the elders had warned her not to go only made the idea more attractive and rebellious in her mind. That afternoon, while the rest of the family was busy preparing for the evening's traditional ceremony, Ngozi quietly changed into a pair of old jeans and a long-sleeved shirt to protect herself from thorns and insects. She packed a small backpack with her phone, a power bank, a bottle of water, and a small knife for cutting plants. She set up her phone on a selfie stick and began recording a video introduction, speaking in a confident voice about how she was going to explore her ancestral roots and discover the healing secrets of the forest. She made sure to mention that she was doing this for educational purposes and to preserve traditional knowledge, carefully crafting her narrative to sound noble and culturally aware. Without telling anyone where she was going, She slipped out of the compound through a small back gate and walked quickly across the cassava farm toward the dark tree line in the distance. As she approached the edge of Igbo-Oro, the temperature of the air seemed to drop suddenly, even though the afternoon sun was still high and hot in the sky. The forest entrance was marked by two very tall trees that stood like ancient gatekeepers, their thick roots spreading across the ground like the fingers of buried giants. The moment she stepped past those trees, the sounds of the village, the talking, the laughter, the clucking of chickens, all faded away as if someone had pressed a mute button on the world. The silence inside the forest was so thick and heavy that it felt like walking into a room filled with invisible curtain that absorbed every sound. Ngozi laughed nervously and made a joke to her camera about how quiet and peaceful it was, trying to hide the small shiver that ran down her spine like a cold finger tracing her backbone. The trees inside Igbo-Oro were massive and ancient, their trunks so wide that it would take 5 grown men holding hands to cycle just one of them. The canopy above was so dense that very little sunlight could penetrate through, creating a permanent twilight atmosphere that made it difficult to judge the time of day. Strange vines hung from the branches like the hair of sleeping giants, and the ground was covered with a thick carpet of dead leaves that released a smell of earth, rot, and something else that Ngozi could not quite identify. She walked deeper into the forest, her phone's camera recording everything as she narrated her journey in a cheerful voice that sounded fake even to her own ears. She tried to ignore the feeling that she was being watched by 1,000 invisible eyes, telling herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks because of the stories she had heard. After about 30 minutes of walking, Ngozi stumbled upon a small clearing where shafts of golden sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating a cluster of plants with broad, dark green leaves that had a slight silver shimmer on their edges. Her heart jumped with excitement because these plants matched the description of Ato that her cousins had been talking about. She quickly pulled out her knife and began cutting several stems, filling her backpack with the valuable herbs while talking to her camera about traditional medicine and ancestral wisdom. She was so focused on her task that she did not notice the way the forest had become completely silent, or the way the air had grown cold enough to make her breath visible in small white clouds. She did not see the way the shadows around the clearing seemed to move and shift even though there was no wind to disturb them. As she stood up to leave, satisfied with her harvest, she suddenly heard a sound that made her freeze in place like a statue carved from ice. It was the sound of a woman crying, but it was not a normal cry of sadness or pain. It was a deep, ancient wailing that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising from the ground beneath her feet and echoing through the trees in a way that made her bones vibrate with fear. The sound was all around her, coming from every direction at once, and it carried with it a feeling of profound loss and anger that made Ngozi's hands shake uncontrollably. She spun around, her phone's camera shaking as she tried to locate the source of the crying, but there was no one visible in the clearing or between the trees. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped, replaced by an even more terrifying silence that pressed against her eardrums like deep water. Ngozi's heart was pounding so hard that she could hear it in her heart like a drum being beaten by a panicked hand. She told herself to run, to get out of the forest immediately. But her legs felt heavy and slow as if they had turned into solid stone. She took one step backward and felt her foot press down on something that was not leaves or soil. Looking down with wide, terrified eyes, she saw that she was standing on a small stone marker that was half buried in the ground, covered with faded symbols and markings that she could not read but somehow understood were very, very old. The moment her foot touched that stone, the air around her seemed to crack open like a broken mirror, and the world shifted in a way that made her stomach lurch with nausea. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees and shadows. She could see, standing among the trunks, the translucent figures of men and women dressed in ancient clothing made of rough fabric and animal skins. They were not solid like living people, but rather like images projected onto smoke, their faces sad and their eyes filled with a deep, burning accusation. These were her ancestors, the spirits of those who had walked this land hundreds of years before she was born. and they were staring at her with a mixture of disappointment and rage that made her want to fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness. One of the spirits, an elderly woman with tribal marks on her cheeks and eyes that glowed like dying embers, stepped forward from the group. Her mouth did not move, but Ngozi could hear her voice inside her own head, speaking in a Yoruba so old and pure that it felt like hearing the language for the very first time. The spirit said that Ngozi was the blood of their blood, but she had become a stranger to her own people, a child who had forgotten the names of those who came before her. She said that the forest was not just a place of trees, but a sacred library where the memories of the family were kept safe, where promises were made and where respect was given to those who had sacrificed everything so that future generations could live. The spirit's voice was filled with a sorrow so deep that it made Ngozi's eyes fill with tears that she could not control. The old woman's spirit raised a bony, translucent hand and pointed directly at Ngozi's chest, and suddenly a vision exploded inside her mind like a bomb of light and sound. She saw a scene from long ago, perhaps 100 years in the past, where a young man from her family stood in this exact clearing making a solemn promise to the ancestors. The man, who looked very much like Ngozi's late father, vowed that every generation of the family would return to Igbo Oro once a year to offer prayers, to clean the ancestral shrine deep in the forest, and to remember the names of those who had built the foundation upon which they all stood. In return, the ancestors promised to protect the family from harm, to guide them in times of trouble, and to bless their children with long life and prosperity. The vision shifted, and Ngozi saw how that promise had been kept faithfully for many decades, with each generation performing the annual ritual without fail. But then she saw her own generation, young people like herself who had moved to the cities, who had changed their names to sound more Western, who laughed at traditional ceremonies and called them backward superstitions. She saw her late grandmother, the woman whose burial had brought her back to the village, standing alone in this same clearing year after year, growing older and weaker, trying to maintain the ritual by herself because no one else in the family cared anymore. She saw the pain in her grandmother's eyes as she realized that the tradition was dying, that the connection between the living and the dead was being broken by the very people she had worked so hard to raise and educate. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, and Ngozi found herself on her knees in the clearing, tears streaming down her face, her phone line forgotten in the dirt beside her with its red recording light still blinking uselessly. The spirits were all around her now, a cycle of ancient faces filled with sadness and quiet anger. The old woman's spirit spoke again, her voice like the rustling of very old, dry leaves. She said that because the promise had been broken, because the family had abandoned their duty and forgotten their roots, the ancestors were now restless and unable to find peace in their rest. The protective blessings had been withdrawn, and misfortune was already beginning to creep into the lives of Ngozi's relatives, sicknesses that would not heal, businesses that were failing, children who were born weak and crying. The spirit told Ngozi that she had been chosen, whether she liked it or not, to restore what had been broken. The herbs she had stolen from the forest were not just plants, but vessels that carried the weight of the ancestors' displeasure. If she brought them back to the village without first making amends, without performing the ritual that her grandmother could no longer complete, a great darkness would follow her home and settle on her family like a curse that would last for generations. The choice was now in her hands. She could continue to run from her heritage and watch everything she loved crumble to dust, or she could humble herself, learn the old ways, and repair the spiritual bridge that her generation had carelessly burned. Ngozi opened her mouth to speak, to ask what she needed to do, but before any words could come out, the spirits faded away like morning mist touched by the sun, leaving her alone in the clearing with nothing but the weight of their message pressing down on her shoulders like a mountain of invisible stones. The forest was silent again, but now it felt different, not threatening, but waiting, watching to see what she would choose. She stood up on shaking legs, picked up her phone and her bag of herbs, and walked slowly back toward the village, her mind spinning with everything she had seen and heard, her confidence and arrogance completely shattered like broken glass scattered on the ground. When Ugozi emerged from the forest, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shadows of deep orange and purple that looked almost unnatural in their intensity. She walked back to the family compound in a daze, barely aware of where she was putting her feet, her mind still replaying the vision of her grandmother standing alone in the forest, abandoned by a family that no longer valued what she was trying to preserve. When she entered the compound, her aunt saw her face and immediately knew that something terrible had happened. The woman did not ask questions but simply called for Papa Adeleke, and within minutes, the entire family was gathered in the main house, staring at Ugozi. Sat down on a low stool and, with a voice that trembled like a leaf in a storm, told them everything that had happened in the forest. She described the crying, the spirits, the vision of the broken promise, and the warning that the ancestors had given her. At first, some of the younger family members looked skeptical, thinking perhaps she had eaten something bad or was making up stories for attention. But Papa Adeleke's face grew very grave and very sad, and he slowly nodded his head as if he had been expecting something like this to happen for a very long time. He looked at Ugozi with eyes that were suddenly filled with a deep, fatherly compassion and said in a quiet voice that she had been given a great and terrible responsibility, but also a great gift, the chance to save her family from the consequences of their own forgetfulness. He explained that the ritual her grandmother had been trying to maintain was known as the Iwe Itan, the ceremony of remembrance, and it required specific items and specific words that had been passed down through the family for generations. Unfortunately, when Ugozi's grandmother had died, much of that knowledge had died with her because no one had bothered to learn it from her while she was still alive. However, Papa Adeleke revealed that there was one person in the village, a very old priestess named Iyamimo, who still remembered the ancient ways and who might be willing to teach Ugozi what needed to be done. He warned her that the path would not be easy. The priestess was known to be very strict and unforgiving, especially with young people who showed disrespect or impatience. If Ugozi wanted to make things right, she would have to humble herself completely, put aside her pride and her modern thinking, and learn the traditions with a sincere heart. That night, Ugozi could not sleep at all, lying awake on her thin mattress as the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the spirits, heard the crying that had come from the earth, and felt again the crushing weight of her grandmother's loneliness and disappointment. She realized, with a painful clarity that cut through all her previous arrogance, that she had spent years building a fake life based on appearances, likes, and followers, while completely ignoring the real foundations upon which she actually stood. She had thought that success meant escaping from her roots. But now she understood that true strength came from being connected to something deeper than Instagram posts and brand deals. By morning, her decision was made. She would stay in the village for as long as it took to learn the ritual and restore the family's connection to their ancestors, even if it meant losing followers, missing opportunities, and looking like a fool to her city friends. The next day, Papa Adeleke led Ugozi to a small, ancient compound on the far edge of the village where Iyamimo lived alone with old cats and a bin of medicinals. The priestess was impossibly old, her skin like dark leather that had been folded and refolded 1,000 times, her eyes milky with cataracts but somehow still able to see straight into a person's soul. When Ugozi approached her with a bowed head and explained what had happened in the forest, Iyamimo was silent for a very long time, studying the young woman with an intensity that made Ugozi feel completely naked and exposed. Finally, the old priestess spoke in a voice surprisingly strong and clear, saying that she would teach Ugozi the ritual, but only if girl was willing to prove that her heart had truly changed and that she was not just performing another role for her soul. For the next 7 days, Ugozi lived a life that was harder than anything she had ever experienced in her comfortable Lagos apartment. Iyamimo woke her up before dawn every single morning and made her walk to a nearby stream to fetch heavy clay pots of water on her head, a task that left her neck aching and her shoulders bruised. She was taught to prepare traditional meals using only firewood and clay pots, grind paper on a stone until her hands were covered in blisters, to wash clothes by hand in cold water until knuckles were raw and bleeding. The priestess did not allow her to use her phone or take any photos, telling her that some knowledge was too sacred to be shared with strangers on the internet, and that the ancestors would be insulted if their rituals became entertainment for people who did not understand or respect them. More importantly, Iyamimo taught Ugozi the history of her family, making her memorize the names of 20 generations of ancestors, making her understand the struggles they had faced, the sacrifices they had made, and the wisdom they had accumulated through centuries of living on this land. She learned traditional prayers in Old Yoruba, words that felt strange and heavy on her tongue but carried a power that she could actually feel vibrating in her chest when she spoke them correctly. She learned to recognize sacred plants, to prepare ritual offerings, and to move through the forest with respect and awareness, understanding that every tree, every stream, and every animal was part of a larger, interconnected spiritual ecosystem that demanded humility and care. By the sixth day, Ugozi's entire body was sore and exhausted, her manicured nails were broken and dirty, and her expensive braids were frizzy and covered in dust. But something profound had shifted inside her mind and heart. She no longer felt bored or impatient with village life. Instead, she felt a strange sense of peace and belonging that she had never experienced in all her years of chasing viral moments and brand deals. She began to understand that her grandmother had not been a backward old woman clinging to useless superstitions, but rather a guardian of something precious and irreplaceable, a living connection to the people who had made her existence possible. For the first time in her life, Ugozi felt truly proud of where she came from, not as aesthetic content for her feed, but as a real, deep part of her identity that could never be filtered or edited. On the seventh day, which was the night of the new moon according to the traditional calendar, Iyamimo declared that Ugozi was ready to perform the Iwe-Itan ceremony. The entire family gathered in the compound just as the sun was setting, and together they walked in a solemn procession toward the edge of Igbo Oro. Ugozi was dressed in simple white cloth, her feet bare, her hair covered with a white-haired tie, carrying a woven basket filled with the items that Iyamimo had taught her to prepare: kola nuts, palm wine, white chalk, honey, and the herbs she had taken from the forest, which she was now returning with the proper prayers and respect. As they approached the forest entrance, she could feel her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. But this time it was a different kind of fear, not the fear of the unknown, but the sacred fear that comes from approaching something greater and older than yourself. Papa Adeleke and Iyamimo led the way into the forest, guiding Ugozi and the rest of the family along a narrow path that she had not seen during her first visit. They walked for what felt like hours, the darkness growing thicker around them despite the burning torches they carried, until they finally reached a small clearing that looked exactly like the place in her vision. In the center of the clearing stood a simple stone altar, half covered with moss and fallen leaves, clearly neglected for many years. This was the place where her ancestors had made their promises, where offerings had been given for generations, and where the spiritual bridge between the living and the dead had once stood under Iya Mimo's quiet guidance. Ngozi began the ceremony, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each word. She called out the names of her ancestors, 20 generations of them. Feeling each name settle into her bones like stones building a foundation. She offered the kola nuts, pouring libations on the ground while speaking the prayers she had memorized, asking for forgiveness on behalf of her entire generation for forgetting their duties and dishonoring the sacred covenant. She placed the herbs back in the clearing where she had taken them, explaining that she had acted in ignorance and greed, but that she now understood the error of her ways and was committing herself to maintaining the tradition that her grandmother could no longer uphold. As she spoke the final words of the ritual, a strange wind began to blow through the forest, even though the night had been completely still just moments before. The wind carried the smell of rain and old earth, and it moved through the trees with a sound like 1,000 voices whispering approval and acceptance. Ngozi felt something lift from her chest, a weight she had not even known she was carrying. And for just a moment, she thought she saw her grandmother standing at the edge of the clearing, her face young and beautiful again, smiling with tears in her eyes before fading away into the darkness like smoke dissolving into air. The spirits had heard, the covenant had been renewed, and the family was once again under the protection and guidance of those who had worked before them. The walk back to the village felt lighter, as if gravity itself had loosened its grip on their bodies. When they returned to the compound, there was a celebration, not the loud, boastful kind that Ngozi was used to from Lagos parties, but a quiet, joyful gathering where the elders spoke words of blessing and the young people listened with new ears. Ngozi's aunt reported that her youngest son, who had been sick with a fever that no medicine could break, had suddenly recovered just as they were performing the ceremony. Her uncle mentioned that a business deal he had been trying to close for months had finally gone through that very afternoon. Small miracles, perhaps, but enough to show that the spiritual doors had been reopened and the blessings were beginning to flow again. Ngozi stayed in the village for another 2 weeks, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She helped Iya Mimo document the ritual in a proper way, writing down every step, every prayer, every ingredient, so that future generations would have a clear guide and would not lose the knowledge again. She convinced several of her younger cousins to learn alongside her, explaining to them in their own language about Instagram and TikTok and fast money that true wealth was not measured in followers or designer bags, but in connections, in roots, in knowing who you are and where you come from. She made a promise to the ancestors and to herself that she would return to the forest every year to perform the ceremony, and that she would teach her own children the importance of honoring those who came before. When she finally returned to Lagos, her apartment felt smaller and emptier than she remembered. Her social media accounts had lost some followers because of her absence, and several brands had moved on to other influencers who were more active and available. But Ngozi found that she did not care as much as she thought she would. She began to shift her content, focusing less on luxury and materialism and more on cultural education, traditional wisdom, and the importance of staying connected to one's heritage. Some of her old followers complained that she had changed and become boring, but she gained new followers who appreciated the depth and authenticity she was now bringing to her platform. More importantly, she gained something that no amount of likes or brand deals could ever give her: a sense of purpose, peace, and belonging that came from being anchored to something. The story of Ngozi's transformation became a legend in her family and gradually spread to other villages in the area. Parents told their children about the city girl who had ignored the warnings, entered the forbidden forest, and returned changed forever, not destroyed, but transformed by the wisdom of her ancestors. The elders would shake their heads and say that it was a shame that it took such a dramatic encounter to teach the young people what they should have been learning all along. But they were grateful that at least one person had heard the message and taken it seriously. The forest of Igbo Oro remained sacred and protected, no longer just a source of fear, but a reminder that some things cannot be modernized away, some connections cannot be broken without consequences, and some wisdom cannot be dismissed just because it comes from the mouths of old people who do not understand Instagram algorithms or brand partnerships. Years later, when Ngozi had children of her own, she made sure they knew the names of their ancestors. She took them to the village regularly, not as a tourist destination or content opportunity, but as their true home, the place where their roots went deep into the earth. She taught them the prayers, showed them the forest, explained the rituals, and told them the story of how their own mother had once been proud, foolish, and disconnected, until the ancestors themselves had reached out to bring her back to where she belonged. And when her children asked her why all of this was so important, why they needed to remember old names and perform old ceremonies when the modern world was moving so fast and offering so many new and exciting things, she would smile and say something that her grandmother had once said, words that she had ignored for too long but now understood with perfect clarity: a tree without roots cannot grow tall, no matter how much sunlight it receives, and a person without ancestors is just a leaf blowing in the wind, never finding a place to land, never finding peace. Remember where you come from, and you will never be lost, no matter how far you travel or how high you climb. The lesson of the forest was not about fear or punishment, but about connection and responsibility. It taught that ignoring your heritage does not make you modern, it makes you incomplete. It showed that the wisdom of elders is not superstition to be dismissed, but knowledge earned through centuries of living, dying, and understanding patterns that the young in their arrogance cannot yet see. Most importantly,
It proved that some debts cannot be paid with money, some gifts cannot be refused without consequences, and some calls from the past must be answered, whether you are ready or not. Because the ancestors do not forget, even when we try desperately to forget them. And so the story ends not with death or destruction, but with transformation and restoration, a reminder that it is never too late to reconnect, never too late to learn, and never too late to honor those who made your existence possible. The forest still stands at the edge of the village, dark and ancient and patient, waiting for the next generation to either respect its boundaries or learn its lessons the hard way, as Ngozi once did.